Okay, let's unpack this. Think about this for a second. 2024, it's the year of the dragon, right? Usually a big year for having kids.
Yeah, traditionally seen as very auspicious.
Exactly. But in Singapore, the fertility rate actually hit a new low, like record low,
It's a really stark number, just 0.97 births per woman.
0.97.
Yeah. And well, it's way below the 2.1 you need just to keep the population stable, without immigration factoring in.
Wow, 0.97. That feels incredibly low. So, okay, what's actually driving this? And I mean, what does it really mean for Singapore? That's what we're digging into today in this deep dive. We're looking at Singapore's, well, declining birth rate.
Mm-hmm.
And we're using a really data-rich article called Why Singaporeans Don't Want Kids Anymore, Singapore's Birth Rate Crisis Explained, plus some related notes you shared.
Right. And our goal today really is to walk through these sources, pull out the key insights for you. We want to get a handle on, why this is happening, what are the impacts, the big implications for society, for the economy, and of course, how the government's trying to respond.
Yeah.
So think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to grasping what's a really critical issue over there.
Okay, good. So let's start with that number again, 0.97.
Yeah.
Just trying to get our heads around the scale of it. It's not just low, it signals a pretty profound shift, doesn't it? Already happening.
Oh, absolutely. And the analysis points out by 2030, which is what, only 6 years away now?
Yeah, not far at all.
1 in 4 people in Singapore will be 65 or older.
1 in 4.
Yeah. That firmly puts Singapore into what they call super-aged territory.
Super 8. And is Singapore completely alone in this, or?
Well, its rate is particularly striking, but no, it's not entirely isolated. You see similar struggles, sometimes even, lower rates in places like South Korea.
Ah. I remember reading about South Korea. Didn't they call it a national demographic crisis?
They did, exactly. Hong Kong, Taiwan, too. It really highlights that, while Singapore has its own unique context,
Sure.
some of these underlying pressures seem to be shared across many of these highly developed, very competitive sort of urban societies.
Okay, so let's get into those pressures then. The material we're looking at, it points to several big reasons why people might be, delaying having kids or deciding not to altogether.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing that usually comes up is money, right?
Yeah.
Cost.
Yeah, finances are definitely a major piece of the puzzle. Raising a child in Singapore, right through university,
Yeah.
it's a huge investment. The estimates they throw around are anywhere from SGD $290,000 up to maybe $360,000.
$360,000. Wow. The article even compares that, saying it's like the cost of a one-room flat.
It really puts it in perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. That kind of scale.
And the sources, they kind of break down those costs too. Like pregnancy and delivery alone can be $5,000, maybe up to $27,000. Then the early years, infant, toddler, that can add up to maybe $92,000. Primary school, another $68,000 or so.
And that's before university.
Exactly. Even local uni is around $69,000, and obviously much more if you study overseas.
So, okay, that's the right financial hit. It's
Yeah.
clearly massive. But the sources are saying it's not just about the money, are they?
No, and this is where it gets really interesting, I think. Beyond just the dollars and cents, the analysis looks at, well, stress levels, lifestyle choices, career priorities. There was a poll just last year, 2023, found a big majority, like 82% of young adults feel being single is totally fine.
Right.
And 72% think, you don't have to have kids just because you got married.
So there's a real, a cultural shift happening at the same time as these economic pressures, a change in attitude.
Precisely. And then you layer on top that the intensity of the Singapore environment. The sources actually describe it as one of the most burnout-prone cities in the world.
Burnout-prone. Wow.
Yeah. Think about it. 45-hour work weeks are pretty standard, sometimes more. Huge academic pressure starting really early, like primary school, and growing worries about mental health across the board.
And that pressure, it connects back to the cost too, right? This feeling that you have to give your kid the best possible start.
Mm-hmm.
So that means top preschools, endless extra classes, private tutors.
Which is interestingly highlighted as a massive industry in itself, like
Yeah.
$1.8 billion as of 2023.
$1.8 billion just on tuition and enrichment.
Yeah, so it's not just about covering the basics anymore. It's about the cost of competing, of navigating this super competitive system and trying to give every possible edge.
The sources also mention something about how kids are viewed differently now compared to, say, our grandparents' generation.
Yeah, that's a really important point. If you go back to the 1960s, bigger families were common. 4 or 5 kids, maybe more. And kids were often part of the family economy, right? Helping out on the farm or in a small business, doing chores, eventually caring for older parents.
Right, they contributed.
Exactly. Contrast that with today. You've got child labor laws, much more individualism. The material kind of argues that children are often seen more as, well, significant financial liabilities.
Or consumers, maybe.
Yeah, consumers of resources rather than economic contributors. That's a
Yeah.
really fundamental shift in how society is structured and kind of what the perceived value is.
That totally changes the calculation, doesn't it? The whole should we have kids calculation in a modern city.
It really does. It changes the fundamental calculus.
Do these pressures affect everyone the same way across Singapore? Or are there, differences we should be aware of?
That's a good question. The sources do point out some variations based on like sociodemographics. You tend to see slightly higher fertility rates in, say, lower income households. Also in less urbanized parts and within certain ethnic groups, like the Malay community often has slightly higher rates.
Okay.
And then conversely, things like higher wealth, being more urban, higher education levels, those tend to correlate pretty strongly with delaying childbirth or maybe choosing not to have kids at all.
So the way people experience these pressures and the choices they make, it's not monolithic. It's not the same for everyone.
Exactly. These factors all interact in pretty complex ways, and it plays out differently across different segments of society.
Okay, right. So we've looked at some of the reasons behind this low birth rate. What about the consequences? What does this mean for Singapore, having this rapidly aging population and fewer young people coming through?
Well, if you connect the dots, the implications are huge. They spread across, well, pretty much all aspects of national life. An older population naturally puts a big strain on healthcare systems. That's kind of the obvious one.
Right, more demand for services.
More demand, more complex needs. It also puts pressure on the tax base. Fewer working-age people supporting a growing number of retirees, and the social safety nets. The sustainability of those nets comes into question.
There was a statistic about the ratio, wasn't there? Working adults to elderly folks.
Yeah, it's quite dramatic. Back in 1990, it was about 10.5 working adults for every person over 65.
Okay.
Now, it's down to just 3.5 to 1.
Wow, from over 10 down to 3.5. That's a massive shift in the dependency ratio.
And that pressure is only increasing. You've got medical inflation, which is a real thing. Healthcare costs rising significantly every year. And things like CPF life payouts, that's Singapore's national annuity scheme. People are asking questions about how sustainable that is long term as the number of retirees just keeps growing relative to the workforce funding it.
What about something like the housing market? You might instinctively think fewer families, maybe less demand for housing. But the sources suggested it's maybe not that simple.
Yeah, it raises an interesting point about asset values, especially for public housing, the HDD flats. The analysis suggests you could see, down the line, an oversupply of resale flats in the older housing estates.
Why older specifically?
Well, as the current residents in those older estates age, they might eventually downsize, move to assisted living, or pass away. This could flood the market in those specific areas, and that could lead to prices stagnating, maybe even falling in those older estates, potentially creating a bigger price gap between the older flats and the newer ones.
Huh. Okay, that's an interesting angle. And then the big one, I guess, is the economy overall. Fewer working adults means, well, smaller local workforce.
Right. Which, as the sources point out, makes it harder to keep productivity growing. It could mean slower economic growth overall. It could impact the capacity for innovation. And it makes Singapore even more reliant on attracting foreign talent and strategic immigration just to keep the economic engine running.
Okay, so this paints a picture of some pretty significant interconnected challenges. Healthcare, social support, housing, the economy. So what's the government doing about it? The material we looked at details quite a few different approaches, right?
Yeah, they've definitely been active, trying things on multiple fronts. You've got the financial angle, various cash gifts, baby bonuses, tax reliefs.
Like relief for working mothers.
Exactly. Working mothers, child relief, qualifying child relief, even tax breaks for grandparents who help with childcare. They've also done quite a bit to make preschool more affordable.
So those are direct financial incentives, trying to ease that cost burden we talked about. What about the other pressures, like the intense academic environment?
Yeah, they're trying to address that too. The sources mention education reforms, things like getting rid of mid-year exams in schools.
Oh, really?
Yeah, trying to reduce that constant testing pressure, implementing something called subject-based banding, which offers more flexibility than the old streaming system, and generally trying to encourage more sort of holistic approaches to learning, not just focusing purely on test scores.
Okay. And what about the workplace?
Yeah.
Helping parents balance work and family.
There's been movement there too. extending parental leave policies for both mothers and fathers, and a definite push to encourage companies to offer more flexible work arrangements.
Right, work from home, flexible hours.
Exactly. The goal seems pretty clear. Help parents manage that really tough balancing act between career demands and family life.
So it sounds like a pretty comprehensive set of policies hitting different areas:
Mhm.
money, education, work-life balance. But the sources seem to imply that even with all this, it might not be enough on its own.
That seems to be the assessment, yeah. Which is why the immigration strategy becomes so crucial. Senior leaders have literally called it existential.
Existential, that's strong language.
It is. They are actively bringing in new citizens, new permanent residents, and the focus is on finding people who are likely to integrate well, contribute economically, and actually settle down, put down roots. It's presented as basically a necessary demographic tool to offset the falling birth rate among locals.
So, okay, it's really a multi-pronged strategy then.
Yeah.
Financial help, social and education changes, and carefully managed immigration.
Yeah, it's definitely an attempt to tackle both the symptoms, the consequences, and at least some of the root causes we discussed.
Yeah.
It shows they recognize how complex this whole thing is.
Okay, so we've explored the causes, the consequences, the government's responses, all based on these sources. If we boil it all down, what's the core takeaway here? What does this deep dive really reveal?
I think the key insight really that comes through from the material is that Singapore's low birth rate. It's not just a statistic, right, or just an isolated economic issue. It's more like a powerful indicator of much deeper shifts happening in society.
Okay.
It reflects how lifestyle priorities are changing, the immense stress people are under, fundamental shifts in cultural values, maybe even how the nation sees its own future.
Right. And the government's policies, the money, the education changes, the workplace stuff, immigration, they're active, they're varied,
Definitely.
but the analysis seems to say they're kind of necessary, but maybe not sufficient by themselves to really turn this trend around.
Exactly. That's the sense you get. The deeper challenge, the one the sources really point towards, is about broader societal adaptation. It seems to require building up real, strong community support networks for families. And maybe most profoundly, it needs a kind of cultural rethink
A rethink of what?
of what success means, you know? What does a family look like in the 21st century? How do you picture the future for Singapore if it's not based on the old models of just like constant population growth? It seems less about just pulling policy levers and more about shifting mindsets, maybe rebuilding some social structures.
That feels like a much bigger, more fundamental challenge than just tweaking policies here and there. It's almost asking for a societal transformation.
It certainly sounds like it. And it's a challenge that, many other developed countries are starting to face too in their own ways.
Right. Which leaves us with something to think about maybe as you reflect on all this. A final thought. Given these huge challenges, these deep societal shifts we've talked about, how does a society like Singapore, or maybe other places facing similar trends, how might they need to fundamentally redefine what a thriving future even looks like? Especially when those traditional ideas about population growth are changing so dramatically. What does national success even mean in this new demographic reality?